Some parents may describe their child as very strong-willed. That child may show an extreme avoidance of everyday demands, expectations, and requests. But what if the behaviors are not an indication of strong will, but rather occur because an individual feels overwhelmed by demands and perceive them as threats to their autonomy and self-control? Are there specific strategies that would be helpful when raising a demand-avoidant child or teen? Well, today we are going to be talking about pathological demand avoidance or pervasive drive for autonomy on the Diverse Thinking, Different Learning podcast.
Millions of kids struggle with learning, processing, and social emotional difficulties. These challenges interfere with their ability to reach their full potential. Dr. Karen Wilson is here to help. Her extensive background in pediatric neuropsychology and higher education have prepared her for this unique mission. Listen as she delivers content to inform, educate, and empower parents and educators. This will enable you to identify challenges that kids face and get them on the road to achieving their full potential. This is Diverse Thinking, Different Learning by Child Nexus.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me today. You've heard the intro, so you know what we are going to be discussing today. So I am going to jump right in and introduce my guest today, Dr. Casey Ehrlich. She is a social scientist, parent coach, and educator, and the CEO and founder of At Peace Parents. Casey brings 15 years of work experience and expertise in social science methodology to help parents and therapists understand how to connect with and accommodate pathological demand avoidance autistic children. She is currently working on empirical research with the University of Michigan Medical School on PDA in children and teens. Hello, Dr. Ehrlich. Welcome and thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited.
I'm excited too. I think before I hit record, I talked about the fact that our topic today is one that many people may not be aware of. Some do. But they recognize some of the behaviors or some of the traits in their kiddos, and they may not know what it is. So for some people, they may be coming to the realization for the first time that, this may be my kid. This may explain why my child has been struggling.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, doctors and other healthcare workers often deal with kids who, resist doing things that they're asked to do, resist ordinary tasks, even when it can benefit them. And we know that these kids and teens might have something called extreme demand avoidance or pathological demand avoidance or PDA. In the academic and researcher world, PDA is described as a survival drive for autonomy and equality, one that consistently overrides survival instincts. But what does that really mean for the everyday parent? How would you describe PDA?
Yeah. Okay. So that's a big question. I'd also love to add that some people prefer pervasive drive for autonomy or protective drive for autonomy. So, and I think that's great to have that alternative as well, because it doesn't always manifest as avoidance. It manifests in lots of different ways. So, the reason I define PDA as you just described is because I do consider it a nervous system disability, because in accumulation, it can disable our children from accessing basic needs like toileting, hygiene, sleep, safety, and eating. But it can look very different across children, which is, I think, why it's not fully recognized in terms of the research and the DSM-5 or 6 coming up, or among clinicians. So the first thing I usually think about is like the root cause of the behavior, right? And often as parents, we're looking at it in a bunch of different ways when we have neurodivergent children. We're like, is the child not putting on their clothes to get ready for school because of a sensory issue? And then we're like, okay, let's try and solve this problem. I'm sort of describing myself here. I'm going to get the weighted blanket. I'm going to get the tagless and shirts and seamless socks. I'm going to get compression shirts, and hopefully that will help with like the task of getting the clothes on, right? So you do that, and then you observe, actually, this doesn't help, right? Or it doesn't help enough. And so then you're like, oh, maybe it's executive functioning. Maybe the child doesn't understand the steps that have to happen to get the clothes on and get out the door. And so we start maybe doing a laminated chart of like, first we do this, then we do this, or helping with social communication. So those three things, just to name a few, sensory, social communication, and executive functioning, can also be sources of demand avoidance, right? But many of the parents and clinicians who come to PDA have worked through those lenses, and it has either not helped or made it worse. And so what we can start to think about is, would it logically make sense if what is causing the observed avoidance is the perception that the child is not autonomous with freedom and choice, or that the parent or other person trying to make them move through the task is above them? Because for a PDAer, that puts them right in the survival part of their brain, the limbic system and amygdala, and they have a nervous system reaction, even if cognitively they're not aware of it because it's subconscious, right? And so, like, that's the very first question we want to ask ourselves. Like, would it make sense through this lens? Like, would some of the paradoxical things start to make sense for your child if we look at it through that autonomy and equality lens? And the other thing we can observe is what's called equalizing behavior. It's also called leveling or compensation behavior. And that is sort of the behavioral expression of the disability, which is the impulsive or reflexive response to that perception to get back to nervous system safety. But it's often controlling or criticizing or trying to get above a safe or a weak person, like the safest nervous system, to get back to nervous system safety. Right? So it can happen in the moment. Like, I was thinking about some examples, recent examples with my son, where, you know, we recently took him to Chicago for spring break with his younger brother, who's 5. And anytime William, my younger son, would say, oh, look, it's, you know, a peacock walking around, it was the subtle perception of, he saw it first. He's not even consciously aware of this. He just reflexively is either like, I saw it first, or is like, well, you didn't see the dolphin, right? So that's like a very subtle expression. But when his nervous system activation was so high without accommodations, the equalizing could look very destructive or violent. And then there's the internalized expression where some children do equalizing towards self. So you might see them destroying their own things, you know, picking their nails, picking out their eyebrows, scratching, self-harm, negative self-talk. So, for example, a lot of the parents I work with are also neurodivergent themselves because it's genetic, right? And one father who is exploring his own PDA identity in relation to his more externalized PDA son was understanding something he hadn't understood about himself, which was when he had an accumulation in his nervous system of all of these perceptions of losses of autonomy and equality, he would pour out his own really nice whiskeys down the drain. We realized it was like he was an internalized expression. So he was destroying his own things to get back to a place of safety, nervous system wise.
Right. And I think one of the things that, you know, really jumps out at me is, again, what we talk about all the time on this podcast is really understanding the root cause of certain behaviors or certain traits or certain things that are interfering with your ability to connect with your child, you know, your child's ability to either access the curriculum at school or connect with peers or do things that we know will keep them safe, right? And it seems that once we understand the root cause, then we can provide the appropriate level of support. Because you talked about looking at some of these behaviors through, a sensory lens or an executive functioning lens or, a communication or a cognitive behavioral lens. And when those interventions that match that lens don't work, then we have to start looking at other things, right?
Absolutely. And that's where I really encourage parents to experiment consistently. The other thing I wanted to add, Dr. Wilson, is just that it's the additional basic needs impact that I think links it to the disability, because often we're just looking at the behavior, but often these children have what I call, or teens or even adults, have what I call a stickiest basic need, where like as that nervous system activation builds in their system, it's cumulative, control starts to coalesce around a basic need. So they increasingly stop eating, or they eat compulsively, or there's a lot of like toileting like regressions that would be a fully potty trained child starting to need to use a diaper again or poop in the bathtub or in a specific way at the age of like 7 or 8, or going into a non 24-hour sleep cycle or needing to co-sleep at the age of like, 11, 12, 13 in order to sleep through the night. And then you have the hygiene, which is it looks like behavioral, the refusal to brush teeth, bathe, engage in hygiene. But some of these children, maybe haven't been able to brush their teeth or bathe in 6 months, and they will physically fight their parents. And so it really becomes about looking at this accumulation of nervous system stress, which is basically causing a trauma response, and looking at concrete root cause ways to bring that down so that it's not disabling them from either primary basic needs or secondary needs like movement, leaving the house, education, in whatever form that looks.
Right. And, as you talk about how PDA can manifest, how it can show up in an individual's life, there's so much overlap with other things that people are more familiar with, right?
Yeah.
There's so much overlap where I can see that can lead to a lot of misconceptions and a lot of, not understanding, why isn't this just oppositional defiant disorder? Isn't this just extreme anxiety? Or, isn't this something else, fill in the blank. And I think part of the reason is because PDA is not in the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual that we use to diagnose individuals with, psychological disorders. And that's maybe why it's not understood and not accepted. But there's always been this disconnect or delay between research, professional training, and public awareness. This is not new, right? And, this has happened with ADHD. It has happened with autism. It's happened with so many other things. And so, researchers are currently looking, at PDA. I think you are involved in a research study as well. And I think there was just a recent article in Lancet Child and Adolescent Health talking about the need for prioritizing research related to PDA. And, at the same time as we're building this awareness, families and professionals who haven't heard about PDA, it kind of leaves them with a lack of support, a lack of resources, and it leaves teachers and parents and professionals unable to provide the appropriate level of support to families who are in need of support and understanding.
100%.
And that's why I love the work that you're doing, because I think if people are listening to this, they're hearing, okay, that sounds like my kiddo. And I love the anecdotes you give, because I think that really takes the definitions that we use when we're conducting our research. And, when we put our clinician hats on, it really helps parents and teachers and other people who have children or adults and teens in their lives who are PDAers, helps them better understand them. And then the next step is, what strategies do we use to empower them, to decrease, this resistance and foster autonomy and flexibility in them?
Yeah. I'm happy to give you a brief overview of.
Yes.
Okay, so when I work with parents, so my background is in social science. I'm a political science by training with a second field in methodology. So I love research myself, but I often think of our kids as like, if we're looking at a normal distribution, and the middle of the distribution is often where we get our evidence-based research, right? The middle of the bell curve, and often we don't know which ones of these data points are neurodivergent kids unless it's a specified study. So often PDAers get misdiagnosed or not diagnosed or just lumped into this, sample that we're studying. But I like to encourage parents to think like, yeah, that research is true, right? Of course, screens can have a negative impact on mental health and, focus. However, your data point that you care about is this one over here outside of the normal bell curve and 2 standard deviations from, the middle of the bell curve. So why don't we take still a scientific approach, but just with your one data point, right?
An N of 1.
An N of 1. And let's develop a hypothesis, which is like we talked about in the first part of our conversation of like, okay, we've been working through this hypothesis of like it's sensory or it's executive functioning or social communication. Let's experiment with a different hypothesis. And the hypothesis being the root cause of the struggles of both basic needs and behavior are related to the perception or neuroception, because it's pre-perceptual, of autonomy and equality. And then we're going to experiment with 12 accommodations consistently and track data along 3 dimensions: nervous system, activation, and behavior. So like meltdowns, equalizing behavior, things that you can actually track. And I teach them to be like, okay, maybe the baseline is 2-hour-long meltdowns a day where there's violence and breaking things. But as we start to experiment consistently with these accommodations, a month out, we start to see, oh, it's a 10-minute meltdown once a day, and they're not throwing things or breaking things. It's just verbal, right? So we're starting to see evidence for our outlier. And so the 12 accommodations that I teach are autonomy, and I'm happy to give examples if that's helpful, but I'll just give the overview. Autonomy, equality, trauma-informed play, nervous system signals of safety that are nonverbal, communications accommodations, which includes declarative language, lowering demands, humor, novelty, dopamine, and sensory intense experiences. And then we have diffusion, de-escalation, and risk mitigation. And I'm forgetting one, but this is sort of what I teach in depth.
Right.
So we break apart each one of these and we're like, okay, how do we accommodate using autonomy, right? And it's deeper than choice, right? It's deeper than, do you want to wear the red shirt or the blue shirt? And it's like, do you want to wear a shirt at all? Right? So of course, we're operating within constraints. Like if your child is in school, they're operating within the constraints of needing to wear clothes. But at home, we, as parents, even though it feels crunchy and uncomfortable and we have to navigate our own biases and conditioning and judgment, we can actually choose to allow our child to be naked if that's what they want. And like, it sounds kind of radical, but like when you're looking at the causality, like if you're actually thinking about the causality of like, if each time I allow my child to be naked if they want, I'm preempting the nervous system response and preventing it accumulating in their body, and I'm establishing felt safety and trust. Over time, that might actually, help them start eating again. And then we can see, okay, I'm willing to take on the judgment of others or the in-laws or my spouse even, and say, you know what, he needs to be naked when he's home from school. And like, the hardest part is not understanding what these accommodations are, it's implementing, because it brings up in all of us, especially, as you're listening to me or people listening, they're probably like, oh, wow, that's a little crazy, right? But when you realize, when your child has gone through nervous system burnout and has stopped eating or has stopped toileting, you start to see these decisions in a different light.
Right. And there's such a spectrum of behaviors. You talked about not eating, maybe not taking care of personal hygiene. But there are other things along that spectrum as well that look like avoidance or extreme, inflexibility with respect to choice. I'm doing this and I'm not doing anything else. And I think anecdotes are so helpful in helping listeners understand the root cause and then the mechanism in PDA, understanding why this isn't willful, why this isn't, sensory only, because there might be, co-occurring things going on.
Yeah. So I'm happy to give, what kind of anecdote would be helpful? From my own life with my son?
Yeah, you can, your own life, or because you've worked with so many families who've struggled in this way with behaviors they just don't understand. Their child is avoiding everyday tasks and requests, even those they might like. It's like, you like to do this. And all of a sudden you are saying, I refuse to do this, right? Or using social tactics to kind of dodge demands, right? That can happen as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that I think is unique about PDA is that it's happening on a subconscious level, and it's not about emotion or even frontal lobe thinking, right? So you might see this. I'll give you an example of my son. One of his special interests is football, American football. And so, he collects the cards. It's a typical sort of quote, restricted interest as an autistic child. And everything's about football. But at the same time that he's engaging in his special interest, loving it and excited about it, he is perceiving constant threat because of not running as fast as the other kid, having to get in line for a drill, missing the ball when it's thrown to him. All of these are perceptions of losses of autonomy and equality. And so he would sometimes have 45-minute thrashing, screaming, spitting meltdowns because his brain was perceiving like there's a lion in front of me. And so the accommodations we had to make were, he needs another safe nervous system there to support him off the field and de-escalate, which was my husband. Right. And this is five years in to changing our parenting where he could even access something like tackle football. Right. But, I think that areas where parents struggle is especially before their child has reached burnout and they've seen the counterfactual of once the child reaches the threshold of all of this nervous system activation, then it tips into a space where you're like, oh, this isn't behavioral. But before that happens, it's really hard to shift the mindset from this is willful, because they do use social strategies, you're trying to talk to them about their homework, and they're maybe oh, do you want to go to that park you mentioned last week? And then if you double down, they'll start to escalate and distract. And it's sort of this escalation, right? But it doesn't start in a place where it seems like a nervous system disability. It's you tell them to do something, they comply, and then they go in the kitchen and pick all the leaves off the plant that's your favorite one as a way of equalizing. But it's in the doubling down, it starts to escalate. If we use the more traditional parenting strategies. So, a lot of parents are not lowering the demands or providing autonomy. Instead, they're sort of doubling down on well, they can put on their own shoes and they need to do their chores and they have to sit at the table. Whereas we can provide a lot of autonomy by being okay, you don't have to eat at the table. You don't have to, you can use a screen while you're eating. You can use a screen while you go to the bathroom or bathe, right? So we can lower the demand not just by taking it off of you, but by actually accommodating you. Like, I will put your shoe on for you, even though you're 13, right? Or I will carry your bags for you because your nervous system, we're trying to lower the accumulation of nervous system activation. But it's really hard to get over that hump of like, well, I need to teach them to be independent, right? And it's very counterintuitive because over time, and by this I mean years, as the nervous system activation comes down and there's trust and the child or teen spends more time here in the frontal lobe, they are able to do more things and learn and empathize. But in order to get them in the frontal lobe, we have to do very counterintuitive things.
Right.
You know, my son, when he equalizes, will sometimes blame me for things and I de-escalate. I don't correct him. Like, yeah, I'm sorry that you feel that way, you know, or sometimes I use humor and, you know, he'll get upset because I forgot a transition treat to get in the car. Cause we have like, I give them a little dopamine to get in past, you know, instead of trying to teach them, you don't get a treat, you have to get into the car. I'm like, let's accommodate with some dopamine and novelty and get that brain into the car so they can go to school. But you know, if my son's like, you forgot, you're the worst mother. Like my own nervous system wants to be like, I do everything for you. I bit your box and blah, blah, blah. But like in a moment of mindfulness, what I call the sacred pause, I'm like, I have a choice. Like I can activate his nervous system and speak to his amygdala, or I can de-escalate and connect. So I'm like, yeah, I mean, how did mommy forget that? That was just so silly. Like, what was mommy doing? You know, just like silliness. And then it de-escalates the moment. And, you know, people always ask, well, are you going to correct him later? And I would say yes, with a huge caveat. Like, maybe we'll talk about it 6 months later. Like, hey, when you say this thing, it kind of hurts my feelings, but it might take a year to even get to the place in our relationship where that doesn't result in a like, stop talking. You know what I mean?
Right, right. And that pause is so important, right, for parents, because it can be incredibly frustrating. It can be incredibly confusing. Again, go back to the point where a lot of the behaviors might seem willful. And when we don't understand, when it's like, you just did this yesterday and it was fine, and now it's not. And the pause in order to de-escalate is so important. You know, you talked about your son, who's autistic. You know, PDA is a profile that falls under the autism spectrum umbrella because it's often seen in autistic individuals. Is it possible for children who do not have autism to also have to be PDAers?
So I don't think I'm the person who should answer that.
The research is probably coming. I mean, you'll probably uncover it in the research that you're doing, perhaps.
Well, I actually don't think we're that far along, just to be completely honest. So I'm not like you, a neuropsychologist who's trained in assessments. What I do know is from seeing patterns from a bird's eye view is that there's a lot of parents and sometimes PDA adults themselves who want me to answer this question, right? Like, I'm ADHD and I think I'm also PDA.
Interesting.
Like, but I'm not autistic. And then we get into the identity versus medical. And I really work more within the identity model of like, if you believe this is what's going on inside of you and you claim ADHD identity and PDA identity, like, who am I to be like, no, it has to be autistic. However, I think the work I do with parents is a little bit different than the research and sort of advocacy academic side of things. And for that side of things, I do think most of the time it does fall under the autism spectrum. I think it can be hard to see, especially when what you're seeing is always a threat response or a shutdown, like fight or flight behavior or shutdown. But then often when parents, like I have a 3-month program where we consistently work through the PDA lens, often towards the end, as the threat response comes down, their children look, quote, more autistic. Like they might be stimming more verbally or physically. They might be, expressing their own identity more in line with autism. And that's not a cause of what we're doing. It's that we're lowering the threat response and they're unmasking, like they're starting to feel comfortable around us.
Right. Absolutely. And it seems that, by again, reducing that threat response, you're also getting them to a place where you can work on building autonomy and flexibility. And it seems that, when you talk about the threat response, which is such a huge part of PDA, which is, again, the need for these nervous system accommodations, you are also developing the sense of safety for PDAers. And when they have that sense of safety, then they can, form those attachments we want with their parents and others in their lives.
Yeah. Like in the Pocket Handbook of Polyvagal Theory, where Dr. Porges writes about what's the relationship between felt safety and attachment, and his wife works on attachment as an academic. And there's this cool part about and she agrees with this, felt safety must precede attachment. So it's not to say that the relationship and attachment hasn't been affected by what's going on, but if we jump too quickly to emotional based attachment stuff and don't first look at this felt safety, which might look very strange, right? Like not asking your child how they're doing, sitting on the floor while you're talking to them, really focusing on your facial expressions to show that the upper part of your face is in safe and social and moving. That doesn't feel like attachment. It feels like mammal to mammal, I'm safety, right? Because I think of attachment and relationship through a fairly verbal and neurotypical lens of I want to ask questions. I want to know you. I want to hear how you're feeling. And that's just not how my son or many PDAers connect. Some do, but we first have to go a level deeper before we can work on the emotions. And this is my perspective.
Right. And going deeper, like you've been saying, takes time. This is not something that's going to happen over, a weekend workshop. It's going to take a lot of work. And, the journey can be incredibly stressful for parents. But, one of the things I think is so important for parents to know is that just because their kids are struggling or they're resisting doing things and it's causing a lot of upheaval in the family's life, it doesn't mean that you're not being a good parent. Right? It doesn't mean that you're not being a good parent. When you don't understand what is happening, it's so easy to feel like you've failed as a parent or that you're doing something wrong. And it's absolutely not true, which is why you coming here and explaining this process and explaining PDA is so important, because light bulbs can go off for parents. And that is critical, because then once the light bulb goes off, then they can seek knowledge and understanding and then seek ways that they can provide support.
Yeah, absolutely. Awareness is the first step for sure.
Absolutely. And it's not just the parents, because these kids are in classrooms and teachers need to understand this as well. When kids are going to extremes to ignore or resist anything they perceive as a demand, it's really easy for these kids to be labeled in the school as behavioral problems.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I have a lot of compassion for the teachers too. The structure of our public schools is, very standardized and not flexible. And that extends to teachers with 24 to 26 students without enough funding, without enough support. And so a lot of the deeper accommodations for PDA children are hard to implement in a public school. But there are things we can do in a classroom that don't require big structural changes. So I think asking less questions and giving flexibility about whether or not the child participates in an activity, if they're activated, which might look like willfulness. Linda K. Murphy's book, Declarative Language, the Declarative Language Handbook, is often one of the first books I share with teachers and therapists using declarative language. And even if you have a teenager, like I often suggest getting below them, like crouching down and when you're speaking to them, just to preempt that sensation that you're above them, which is again subconscious.
Right. And then also can trigger that perceived threat, right, in them, and then ramp up that nervous system response.
Absolutely.
Now, again, it's kind of this journey of learning, right? We talked about the delay between the research, the understanding, and you were on your own journey. I mean, you're a clinician and you came to your own understanding of PDA. This is not something that was taught to you in your degree program. You learned about it on your own. It's so interesting. I'd love for you to share that story before we end today.
Sure. So my story is the reason I'm so passionate about working with parents specifically, and why that's my focus, because I had a very tumultuous and painful and isolating journey. So, my son hit nervous system burnout around the age of 4.5, and he stopped eating. He stopped largely speaking. When he would interact with us, he would often hiss and growl or say, stop talking. He would say his legs don't work and he would need to be carried places. And, he would have these feral meltdowns that lasted hours, and I couldn't approach him, and he seemed like a wounded animal that would lash out when I got near him. And my husband and I were like, did something happen? Was there a traumatic event? And we explored that. And it's coming up on 5 years. Father's Day 2019 will always be scarred in my memory because I was, trying to do nice things for my husband, like have a day off from parenting. And I was so distraught that I was like, can I go to yoga? Because I need to reset my nervous system. And I was in the yoga class, weeping, I could not stop crying. And then I came home and something set off Cooper. And I had not a newborn at the time. How old was he? 8 months? And I would pick him up and run out of the house because there would be flying objects, and it was really scary, right? And when I came back, my PDA son had locked my husband in the basement, and it was this very scary incident because he was only 4.5, and he would elope and run, and it was just really scary. And that day, I made the decision to leave my job. I was working at a large research and policy nonprofit in downtown DC on research integrity, actually. I ran a team for the organization. So I put in my notice, and, DC flavor is where's your next job? Who are you leaving us for? And I'm like, I'm going to take some time to be a stay-at-home mom. And it was just jaws dropping, because I was pretty career oriented. But I didn't know what to do. I was just I need to figure this out. And my husband and I decided to move back to Michigan, which is where I am now, as I talked to you, where I'm from, so that we could afford to have one parent with an income and the other one focused on the child. So for about a year, I worked through a gentle parenting and sensory processing lens, and that improved things. But then there were all these paradoxes and confusing points of why aren't the sensory things helping enough? Why do we still have all of these power struggles? And I remember during the pandemic, both boys were home with me. And, I was trying to do all the things that I'm describing through the different lenses of okay, maybe he's autistic. I'm making a laminated chart, and we have a schedule and a routine, and it's first then statements. And he was, I didn't know this, but he was perceiving subconsciously my desire to give him routine and structure and support as a loss of autonomy, because I was deciding and pressuring him to get to fresh air, right? And then his occupational therapist here in Michigan was like, you might want to check out this PDA thing. And I was like, I can't take another acronym. And then about 4 months in, I hit a really low point and gave up on screen time limits and was just like, I can't live like this. And so I explored PDA. Like the first book I read was Understanding Pathological Demand Avoidance Syndrome, which is a good book, but also pretty induces despair, at least in the last chapters, because it's just like, here are all these poor outcomes.
Oh, gosh.
And I thought to myself, and maybe this is my own stubbornness, I was like, this is not going to be the outcome for me. And it's not going to be the outcome for every kid. Like, it doesn't have to be like this. Right. And so I actually started a podcast and a website with another mom here in Michigan called PDA Parents. It's still up if people want to look at it. And we did a podcast. We did 8 episodes called PDA Parents of us talking about our experience. And then people started writing to us. And I had no idea there were so many parents with this experience. And we recorded those during the pandemic in a garage in snow pants here. And it sort of took off, right? Like I started a coaching practice. I mean, I definitely learned a lot from adult autistic advocates and PDA adults, a lot on social media, a lot of reading about trauma and polyvagal theory, and then bringing in my academic logic to say, like, okay, like, how can we experiment with a different way? And bringing in at first all my trial and error, that all the things I failed at, and being like, this is why it doesn't work. This is why we can try this. Because believe me, I tried all the things, to try and make it go away and try and fix him. And I mean, I can rattle off so many different therapies we tried, and just to make parents feel better on their endless search for like the fix. And so a lot of what I teach now is also like, how can we radically accept that this is the way the brain works and the nervous system works, as the first step to transcending some of those constraints of, like, when we accept it and lean into it, we can really start to see movement in our relationship and in our kids' well-being. But it takes letting go.
Right. Yes, absolutely. That control that can trigger that nervous system response in our kiddos.
Yeah. I mean, I would say the majority of parents are on a spectrum from really anxious to PDA themselves and every neurotype in between. So I always say, like, of course you're having a hard time moving through this, what I call the paradigm shift, because it's triggering your nervous system.
Right.
And you want to be certain and in control and have autonomy.
Right. And I think that you sharing your personal journey is going to be helpful for so many people listening, because their journeys may seem very similar to yours, and they've tried everything. They've tried OT and they've tried speech because they think it's a communication issue, or they've tried executive functioning coaching because they think it's executive functioning related. And this could be their aha moment where they come to better understand that this might be PDA, and then we'll explore it further. And, I really hope that listeners will connect with you to learn more. And, these are listeners who want to work through, their child's journey through this experimental lens that you talked about, right? Because every child is different. Every child is going to have their unique needs and their unique triggers and their unique family. And so they have to be open to an approach that allows them to experiment and, like you were saying, collect data points, and then double down on what's working so that they can really help their child.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. You described it quite well.
What is the best way for people to get in touch with you? Because I imagine that, just like those who listen to that podcast that you started initially, that they're going to be hungry for more information, want to know more, and are interested in, how do I better support my child who, it seems, is a PDAer?
Yeah. So I often the first touch point for many parents is social media, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, Facebook. So I've got basically everything I teach. Basically everything I teach is available for free. It's just not me live, working through it with a group of families and a cohort, right? So if you want to DIY it, there's the At Peace Parents podcast. I go live almost every Thursday on Instagram at 9 a.m. New York time. It's called Coffee with Casey. We have a free Clarity Masterclass that we can link here. That's called the Clarity Masterclass. So that's a short training that I did live originally, but it is helping parents decide if they believe their child fits the 5 characteristic framework that I've developed to understand PDA, which is the survival drive for autonomy, observable equalizing behavior, high masking, cumulative nervous system activation, which often looks like a fluctuating disability. So sometimes your kid looks typical and other times not at all. And then the constant need for signals of nervous system safety through undivided attention. And then there's 7 PDFs. There's a transcript. There's a PDF of the 5 characteristics. There's a PDF of how to prepare for an autism evaluation with your PDA kid. So that will get you on my email list. You can always opt out, but I send out a newsletter every Friday. And then, I run a signature program, which is an intensive 3-month comprehensive time together live. And we have 2 other coaches in there with us and guest experts and a moderated community. And it's sort of like a college course where we're 3 months, we're experimenting with this lens, we're collecting data, we're working through our sticking points, we're supporting each other. So I run that 3 times a year. We just had our launch last week. So the next one will be September 2024 for a live cohort. And then, we have coaching as well, 2 coaches.
Wonderful. A lot of great resources for families and people who want to know more and learn more. And, it's so helpful. This conversation was wonderful. You provided such great information, a lot of new information for a lot of listeners. I'm learning things new about PDA. It's not something that was a part of our training. That's why we have continuing education. This should be a big part of it. And I think the research is just emerging. And like we said, this is the case with everything that we've come to discover about, neurodivergent profiles, neurodiversity. And so I can't thank you enough for sharing this information and for being here with us today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Thank you so much for joining me today. If you would like to get more information about PDA, be sure to check out the show notes. And be sure to go to childnexus.com and get on our email list so you'll be the first to know about upcoming episodes, webinars, and other resources we share with the Child Nexus community. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening to Diverse Thinking, Different Learning by Child Nexus. For more resources, visit us online at childnexus.com.